Hello, I'm Bruce DuPoit. Coming up today on News Talk, new federal oversight for Metro. The move, an apparent sign that federal officials lack confidence in the agency to solve its safety and reliability problems. What will it mean for WMATA and for passengers? We'll ask David Alpert of the blog Greater Washington. Also, end of an era. Playboy announcing it will no longer show pictures of bare naked ladies in its magazines. Will people read it for the articles? We'll ask Michael Williams of 106.7 The Fan.
From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DuPoit.
Hey everybody, welcome in on this Tuesday. It is so great to have you with us today. We've got a terrific lineup on tap. It's a new day for Metro. The Federal Transit Administration will now oversee safety at the agency. The move was announced late last week by Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx. The move comes after a January incident that left one person dead and a derailment downtown that snarled traffic throughout the region for hours. As the Washington Post reported, day-to-day operations would continue to be under the auspices of Metro, but Federal Transit Administration officials could intervene when safety concerns arise. Officials could conduct surprise inspections and issue directives to Metro to immediately address safety problems in the system. David Alpert runs the blog Greater Washington. He tracks Metro affairs closely and joins us now. It is great to have you here. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you, Bruce.
There was talk that there would be new oversight, new overseers for Metro, particularly in the top priority area of safety, but the FTA is not what we were expecting.
That's right. The National Transportation Safety Board, which is the organization that investigates transportation crashes and fatalities and things like that, recommended that the Federal Railroad Administration take over safety oversight. But there were a number of people raised some concerns about that, and Secretary of Transportation Anthony Foxx decided to give it to the Federal Transit Administration, which mostly handles things like funding for transit projects.
Could this be better for the agency? Could this result in a more streamlined process?
There are definite advantages of doing this over the recommendation to give it to the Federal Railroad Administration. However, I also have a lot of concerns about any federal takeover of oversight in general. There's a system in place now for a commission made up of people from D.C., Maryland, and Virginia to oversee the safety of Metro.
The Tri-State Oversight Committee, I think it was called.
That's right. It's now that it's called the TALK for short, Tri-State Oversight Committee, and there is a plan being floated to create a better interstate agency that has more autonomy and its own funding and staff and things like that to do a better job. That's really the right answer that most everyone agrees in the long run we should get there. I'm nervous about the federal role in the interim as well.
Do you think the federal move will end up in hindsight to have been temporary, and that an improved Tri-State Oversight Committee, I mean,
right.
I don't want to get too bogged down in
Sure.
the bureaucratese, but
right.
To the extent that this belongs probably closer to the region and not as a federal thing, that we might get back to that point relatively soon. That would be the hope anyway, and
right.
with a better organization embodied in that role.
That's right. So if in any other city's transit system, say Boston's or something like that, the role of for the urban subways anyway, or things that are like Metro, there's a state agency that performs the oversight responsibility, and that is there's a federal law that each state sets up some sort of agency to handle that. In the case of Metro, Metro is not inside any one state. That's why it has this interstate entity that handles its oversight. The one that's there now has not been functioning very well, and that's been known since after that Fort Taunton crash in 2009. There were a lot of problems that came out about how the safety oversight entity was functioning, and it's clear from what the NTSB has found from the recent fatality at L'Enfant this year that those problems have not gone away.
What do you think compelled Secretary Foxx to act?
Certainly the NTSB making its recommendation. The NTSB is sort of independent of everyone else, and it makes recommendations, but then it's up to other entities in government to decide whether or not it makes sense to implement those. There were a lot of calls for fixing the safety problems, and I think the fact that the region's governments weren't moving fast enough to fix them on their own did increase the calls for the federal government to take a role.
Phone lines open as we talk with David Alpert. He's the driving force behind the blog Greater Washington. We're also dependent on Metro, and we're all hoping that the transit agency is able to up its game going forward for all the obvious reasons. The number is posted to the bottom of the screen. If you would like to join the conversation this time, we would love to have you. We're able to take calls in the 11 a.m. hour, so if that's when you're watching, grab an open line at 703-387-1020. We'd love to get your thoughts, and we'll go to the phones as your questions and comments come in. What do you think the response within Metro will be, or what has it been to this move, both in terms of the folks with day-to-day managerial responsibility as well as the board, whose role I think has been has been criticized because it's taken them so long to find a replacement for former CEO Richard Sarles and for other matters as well. What has the reaction been, and what do you hope the reaction is?
I think that certainly there's a mixed reaction among different folks, and I think that the danger is, and I think a lot of people in Metro are worried about that, is how the FTA will respond to some of the trade-offs that have to be made in terms of how do you spend your money. Obviously, if there's a significant safety problem, money needs to be spent to fix that safety problem. But also, it's important to make sure that the service continues. There have been a lot of slowdowns, for example, on the train. And if that's what's necessary to keep there from being a derailment, then they need to run more slowly. But everyone also wants to make sure that that slowdown is only temporary. And in some old systems in other cities, there have been places that there have been permanent slowdowns because people were just so nervous about there being something ever happening that it meant that the system was crippled permanently. And nobody really wants that to happen. So will the FTA's greater involvement now in safety mean that it will say that Metro should make a trade-off that means that the service is permanently or in the long term crippled in the interest of what might be an infinitesimal change in safety? And I'm not convinced that the FTA is quite equipped to make the right trade-offs when it comes to that sort of thing.
Jack Evans, the D.C. councilman from Ward 2, Jack Evans, was on the Kojo Namdi show recently. He's also a member of the Metro board, and I thought he was quite candid. I thought his comments were interesting. He said, I understand the concerns people have. We're motivated to get a move on. And by the way, show me the money. Give me my money, and I will fix these problems. As a region, we have probably underinvested in Metro, and we are all therefore responsible, or to blame, if you want to say it that way, for the status quo at the agency.
That's right. And underfunding, some of this also is over a long period of time. In the 1980s, in the 1990s, there was, when the system was much newer and a lot of parts were even still being built, there was not perhaps as an immediate need to keep repairing old pieces, but that should have happened. And because that didn't happen, things weren't repaired as they aged. Therefore, the system has started to fall apart. The FTA also has, in some ways, not helped that situation. They found that there were some procurement errors that Metro had made, which were potentially serious, but their response was to take money away from Metro, which is really the only thing that they could legally do. But that's actually made the problem worse as well. So sometimes the federal regulators are in this situation where the only thing they can do to help to try to fix a problem is to actually hurt the transit system in a way. And that's a dangerous situation because, so what are they going to do if they feel like Metro is not responding to a safety issue? Will they take away more money, and then does that just get Metro into a spiral of problems?
No question about it. Metro ridership is down.
That's right.
An internal Metro report was very candid about the factors that have contributed to the reduction.
It's very nice actually to hear. It's very sad to see that Metro ridership is down. It's very nice to see that Metro is at least being much more honest and upfront about what some of the long-term trends are. The ridership has not been growing. It was a few years back, and now it has stopped, and there are a number of reasons for that. That is meant a certain amount of a long-term dangerous budget outlook. If ridership does not start to pick up, the revenues will be flat, but things like labor costs will at least rise with the cost of living. And so what do you do if your revenues aren't growing and your costs are? That's a dangerous situation for a transit system, which can lead to sometimes what's called a death spiral, where the agency has to raise fares to close the gap, but then that makes people continue to stop riding, and then they have another gap, and so forth. And we need to make sure that does not happen.
Evans expressed some hope that a new general manager would be found in November,
yes.
keeping in mind that Richard Sarles announced back on September 24th of 2014 that he would be departing. So this has been a long process.
Yes.
If we get to November, which is next month, and they find someone good, they get someone, B, get someone good, then I think there will be some reason for optimism that the agency can begin to deal directly and expeditiously with some of the challenges that it has.
That's right, and clearly getting a new general manager and an excellent general manager is by far the top priority. So it's good that the board is now focusing on that. It's good that everybody is focused on that. This needs to be someone who's good. It needs to be someone who can both handle the internal management responsibilities inside the agency and also be a good public face, who can inspire confidence, who can tell people they're going to fix the problems, who's willing to be honest about what those problems are, so that everyone can think, okay, now Metro's turning over a new leaf, things are going to get better, and then actually be able to reform the internal culture of the organization, which needs reform.
City Paper had a wonderful feature, it's still online now, where they surveyed a wide range and a fairly broad, a fairly large list of people to say, and folks like Gabe Klein, folks like Dan Tangerlini, a representative from the new Metro Riders Union. What would you do? And this wasn't meant to be just a bashing session or blue sky, but seemingly doable improvements. How did that feature strike you? Were there any takeaways that you grabbed onto?
There were a lot of great ideas, and I think the thing is that people in the region, the experts and the people who follow Metro, they know what needs to be done. It's about whether it can be executed. It's clear that there's an internal culture within the agency that needs reform. People don't speak up about problems that they have noticed in the course of their jobs. People hide information. The agency as a whole, until some of these recent presentations, hasn't really been forthcoming about its long-term challenges. There was more of a culture of just say everything's fine, and then maybe some of these problems that are under the surface won't ever bubble up into a real problem. The problem with that is then when they do bubble up, everyone says, wait, why didn't you tell us? With the L'Enfant incident in January, they knew that there were problems with the radios. And people wanted to fix those problems, but they hadn't gotten them fixed. But people outside the agency didn't know about it. So it was more shocking and more upsetting when it happened. The derailment a few months ago, someone knew. And it was more upsetting that it hadn't been escalated within the agency as opposed to when it could have been, as opposed to that it happened. Because no one was hurt. It was an unoccupied train. It was not good that it happened. But if they had said, well, we're going to fix these problems, that's one thing. To know that they could have fixed it and didn't is worse.
The huge opportunity that was missed when that test train didn't trigger more of a response.
Exactly. And so it's that kind of, those surprises, I think, that are worse than the problems themselves in a way.
David Alpert runs the blog Greater Washington. Always great having you here. Great perspective. Thanks very much for your time. We'll see you again soon. We'll take a quick break. We are back with more News Talk right after this.